Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Literacy View. I am so excited for this episode. I am finally meeting my friend from Spelllinks, someone who I've been communicating with forever, but this is the first time I'm getting a chance to actually see her in this conversation. So this is real teacher Harriett Janetos, and she is a teacher in California, and she wrote a book that is fabulous. It is called From Sound to Summary, Braiding the Reading Rope to Make Words Make Sense. And it's available on Amazon. And Judy Boxner was just holding it up. Great book. What I love about it is that it's so practical, and it's really a culmination of the years of experience Harriet has. And she and I have had so many conversations, and we have so much in common. Let me share with you a little bit about Harriet. Harriet has over 35 years in education. Harriet has taught every grade level, K to 12, beginning reading to advanced placement English. After teaching high school English for 8 years, she took child rearing leave and spent that time presenting as a teacher consultant for the Bay Area Writing Project, getting her master's in writing instruction and doing volunteer lessons in her children's elementary school classrooms. Following a move to the elementary school level, where she taught kindergarten through 4th grade, she received a reading specialist credential and has worked as a reading specialist for the past 13 years. Initially with grades 4th to 6th, and then over the past 8 years with grades 1st and 2nd. This year, she published an instructional guide to reading, as we said before, From Sound to Summary, Braiding the Reading Rope to Make Words Make Sense. And I want to start off by just saying that Harriet's writing is just so clear and so just to the point. She wrote a blog that I posted on my website, highfiveliteracy.com. So the link will be in the show notes. It is called, Do Our Literacy Heroes Fail Us, or Do We Fail Ourselves? So what happens when the experts get it wrong? I'm going to kick off this conversation with a quote from Harriet's blog, and then we'll get into our conversation. And she said, when a widely disseminated recommendation is stated as a certainty rather than a possibility, spreads quickly, gains momentum, and finally emerges fully formed like Athena out of Zeus's head and claims a seat in the staff room, this is worrisome. So, Harriet, tell us what you meant by that. And if you could give us a little context for why you wrote this blog.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you. Long-time listener, first-time guest. I wrote this blog because I was really moved by Amina McLean's blog. And I know you had Amina on a few weeks ago, a month ago, whatever it was. And she wrote a blog, Has the Science of Reading Become a Rampant, Thought-Terminating Cliche? And she did an incredible job juxtaposing expertise with experience. And sometimes experts know something very narrowly about a subject, which doesn't actually translate to the classroom. And we can't be passive receivers of knowledge or their expertise and just run out and do these things. And in that same paragraph, of course, we have the recent example of Emily Hanford's Sold a Story, where experts came up with an idea and disseminated it, and it took hold in all of our classrooms, all of our schools. And so, how do we, as mere teachers, what's our role in rejecting expert advice or so-called expert advice? This is a burden, and I don't have the answer for how the hardworking teacher is able to shoulder this burden.
Yes, and it is really challenging. Judy, we did have Amina on, and we had a great conversation with Amina about how, teachers are just using these sound bites. They hear it, they pass it around, these slogans, and it kind of waters down the whole idea of the science of reading, which also has become just a label in some cases. Not that that's what it was intended to be, but that's what it in fact has become often enough. So in Harriet's blog, she wrote, "Full transparency from researcher to practitioner is too often lacking." What are your thoughts about that when we look at this research and then we have to take it into the classroom? Is there a gap, a research to practice gap? Do you have any thoughts about that?
So I think I have to give our show a little bit of credit. I think that research to practitioner gap has been very wide for a very long time. Like, I didn't really talk with the researchers. Really, some of the articles that were written were so like technical and not user friendly for me as a teacher in the field that's just trying to, do what's best for kids on a daily basis. And sometimes it's really overwhelming. Like, sometimes, after work, I don't feel like reading a 23-page study, but I know it's really, really important. So I think that one of the things that I've loved about being on the Literacy View, which is a passion project for myself, and I think Faith as well, is that, researchers really love the Literacy View. They have been communicating with us. They have been breaking down the research for us in a very user-friendly manner that, is more accessible to the average teacher. So much to this, to the point that, research comes out and I'm not waiting years for like these idol like figures to say, "Oh yes, do this, listen to the research." No, there's direct communication about things that are evolving. Like, we had Tiffany that shared some research on phonemic awareness and how that evolved. And you know what? I wasn't scared to go into the classroom and make some shifts immediately. I didn't have to wait till I'm not going to name anybody's name because I'm not going to, I'm sensitive to not hurting anybody's feelings. But I think those conversations are critical, and I don't think that they were happening enough. And I'm really proud of the Literacy View and how far we've come with, being a place where researchers, A, they have fun, B, they're sharing in a way that's so friendly. And I think that, we brought voice to those discussions, right? Sometimes articles would come out, people would read them for like a day or two, and then they would be forgotten. But we're actually bringing that research to life. And I think we even motivated, Faith, if you can remind me, one researcher, I think, wrote an article in a much more user-friendly format.
Yes, it was Kathy Rassel.
That was
And
crazy. That was amazing.
She's an expert researcher, but she has started to write blogs for the average person, the average teacher, the average person interested. So now, Harriet, this is very interesting what Judy said. It actually is something that comes right out of your blog, and I'm going to use it. You had said in your blog, tasking teachers with evaluating expert advice and determining the right reasons to accept or reject it is a tall order. And that seems to be what's been happening, where teachers look at each other and they're like, I can't really do this in my classroom. Did they really study this? Is this what it's supposed to be? What are some of your thoughts about that, Harriet?
That's a good question. I want to respond first to what Judy mentioned. Tiffany, right? You heard Tiffany Peltier. Am I right? Make a suggestion, and you said you went out and applied it immediately because you trusted her. And she's an example of someone who backs up the research with concrete suggestions. And as teachers, we can look at that suggestion and say, this will work, this won't. And if she makes a suggestion that may not have a concrete example, but you know how to apply it, she's already gained credibility. So tasking teachers, this is where I think experience comes in. When I entered the elementary level, I was, like so many of our schools, in the writer's workshop, reader's workshop, balanced literacy context. And I had been teaching writing at the high school level, and I had my master's in writing instruction. And then I had to attend workshops where we were told, for example, you could only do a mini lesson. And I'll never forget this presenter, that had to last between 6 and 12 minutes. And I'm thinking to myself, I need to give a maxi lesson sometimes. I need to teach these kids something. And of course, I'm going to break it up, and it's going to be interactive. And if you'll notice, very recently, and this is good, a lot of direct instruction proponents are very clear that it's not a lecture, that direct instruction is interactive, which I think is important. Anyway, I got into a professional disagreement with this presenter because it made zero sense. But if you don't have that background, if you don't have that experience, and your leadership has bought into it, well, this is why we're in the mess we're in. I mean, this is why Emily Hanford has had to come and over the past 5 years do what she's done and do her podcast. But we run the risk now of having the news stories, right? I mean, and we see this playing out with knowledge building versus strategy instruction.
So let's stop right there. Let's take that. Let's run with that, because you said a lot right now.
That's so funny that you're, Faith, that's funny that you're stopping Harriet. You know, when I have the fun questions to ask, it wasn't the most fun question, but I had that written down, skills versus strategies. So funny that just randomly came up. Or not so randomly.
So, Harriet, we are going to try to call BS on some of these practices. You know, we have the BS button, and you know, we might be using it a lot tonight because when we have to sort through this mess, you know, we have to really say, maybe this was well-intentioned, but is there real research backing something up? So, Harriet, let's go with what you just said. Knowledge building versus the idea of comprehension strategy instruction. What are some of your thoughts based on what we're hearing? As teachers, we're getting a lot of mixed messages. You could listen to Natalie Wexler, and then after a while, It could be somebody else coming out with something. Leslie Lord, who was on our show, as well as Natalie Wexler, very different viewpoints. What's your thought on that?
I really like, again, back to Tiffany Peltier, her recent article on comprehension instruction, where she juxtaposes strategy instruction with building knowledge by showing the relationship between them is strategy instruction is in the service of building knowledge. And those of us who work in high needs schools where children don't have a lot of literacy experiences in the home need help navigating a sentence and a paragraph and an article. And that navigation is a strategy that works. It's finding those high-powered strategies. The IES practice guide that was written by, co-written by Sharon Vaughn, and we know her credentials. She talks about the importance of teaching students to get the gist. Summarizing is difficult for all of us. It doesn't come natural, and it certainly doesn't come natural despite, as Tim Shanahan pointed out, how much the kid knows about electricity. They don't necessarily make the connection of what's going on in this article.
Faith, why are you not giving Harriet the cheers button? I'm disappointed.
Because I would be cheering throughout, but here it goes. 100%. So Judy, again, a lot of the people we're going to be talking about tonight, we've had on the show. As a coach, as you mentioned, you're in the New York City schools. You're a coach. You taught. Listening to these messages, don't you feel like there are a lot of mixed messages and it would be hard for the average teacher to sort through this? What are some of your thoughts, Judy?
So I definitely think it's hard for a lot of teachers to navigate through it. I mean, it was hard for me. Like when I started this journey into structured literacy 7 years ago, was a very different experience on where I am now. I think that, with all these programs that are coming out to schools right now and, delving deeper into curriculum, that's where we can't just assume that you open up a box and that things are going to go well. That's just not the way it goes. And the reason I am where I am now professionally, and I feel good about where I'm at, I'm supporting a school that's struggling and I'm starting to see some gains. It's year one coaching full-time in this site, but it's because I have an understanding. And no matter what program is going to come my way, I have an understanding of how kids learn how to read, how kids need to learn how to decode words, what's important in terms of phonemic awareness, and what shifts I might need to make in my instruction. So I think the most important thing is to really move away from that idolizing. And I was one of those people, I'll be honest with you, like 7 years ago when I was on the universal literacy team in New York City, they would tell us, oh my God, Anita Archer's coming. And I literally thought that this was like as fascinating as like Lady Gaga coming. Like this was like, holy cow, let me take a picture, let me stand online. And it's nice because yes, these people they've devoted their whole life to this profession and career, but at the end of the day, they're just people, right? We're all in this together, just trying to help kids. And you know what? I'm not an important person. I'm just regular Judy that wakes up in the morning, like you, Faith, right? We're going to work, we're in the field. But I think that what Harriet mentions is a big piece of it. The fact that we're working in the field with kids is really what matters so much. And not giving voice to teachers and what's working in the field and how it's going and having those deeper conversations is really not doing a service to kids. And yes, journalists have exposed the truth in many cases, right? But at the end of the day, who's working with those kids? Who's watching how their fingers are moving? Who's watching what their faces are doing when they come to a point of difficulty and need to, decode a word and they don't know how to do it, or they do know, right? So we have to give power back to our teachers. We have to honor where they're at in terms of their learning journey. And we have to continue building that pedagogical knowledge. And we have to stop treating people like they are gods.
So I want to jump into that.
People.
Just people. And I think that's such a good point, Judy. A while back, Harriet, I know the Reading League came out with T-shirts, and it was like a black T-shirt, and I forget the names on it, but it said Seidenberg, maybe it said Kilpatrick. I have no idea. There were like 4 names on it. And why would I walk around with a T-shirt with other people's names on it? They're just people. Again, it kind of feeds into the idol worship stuff. And I think that's problematic. Speaking of Kilpatrick, when we talk about when experts get something wrong, he was promoting this advanced phonemic level proficiency. And, there was a lot of debate about this. And it's not to say that he didn't come up with some wonderful information that was useful, but there were things where there wasn't research backing this up. How do you think, Harriet, that played out as a teacher and in the schools when all these classrooms were jumping to maybe, get on board with some of the things he was saying?
Right. Okay. So this issue is really complex. And I want to preface it by saying that David Kilpatrick's Essential Books was one of the most helpful books I have ever read. And I think, did that come out 6 years ago? I think that's when I really first learned about orthographic mapping.
And I would agree with you. I just want to jump in and say, that's the point. There are these positives, and I would agree 100%. Sorry to interrupt.
No, quite. And the context is important. And, I don't know who's responsible for popularizing orthographic mapping in the last few years. It actually, I didn't realize to what extent it existed before then. I mean, and Linnea Airy, and she did some 2014 research. But anyway, as far as my hearing about it, it was through his book. And that discussion that I referred to in my blog on Tim Shanahan's blog was one of the most interesting back and forths I have read with researchers responding to researchers and stating their points of view, where there's research, where it's lacking.
Could you clarify that a bit for people who might not be familiar with Tim Shanahan's blog?
Yes. Okay, so he wrote a blog, RIP, Advanced Phonemic Awareness. And he had spent a good deal of time talking with David Kilpatrick, asking him questions. And I believe he says on that blog that David may know more about alphabetics than any of us, which is probably true. But that there wasn't enough research to support beyond segmenting and blending. And certainly as an extension of that, oral only phonemic awareness, that there wasn't enough research. And that discussion ended with David Kilpatrick saying that his research had been paused by the pandemic and that he was looking forward to getting back to it, which I think is what you want to hear from researchers. However, he hasn't had a chance to finish his research, but you're right. Suddenly we have all these programs, one in particular that came out and that was adopted, and the change has been so quick that program wasn't in existence before they altered it and added, right, a phonics component or with letters. I mean, it's dizzying. And, you know, we really need to take a deep breath before we go out and buy these programs. But a follow-up to Tim Shanahan's blog and that discussion was written by Nicola Bell, and she wrote an excellent report called A Deep Dive into Phonemic Proficiency, examining the same topics. And she took a close look at the other book, not the Essentials book, but Equipped for Reading Success that David Kilpatrick wrote. And it's interesting. My experience with that book was that our school psychologist came to me and said, look at this chapter on orthographic mapping. What would you pull out to share with new teachers as activities that you've done that you would promote? And there were some excellent activities. And so I wrote up a document and I said, this is what he recommends. This is the language he uses. This is what I do. This is how I do it. You should consider, using these methods in your classroom, these activities. Because I had not read the whole book, I didn't realize until Nicola Bell pointed this out, that there's a recommendation not to teach phonics to students who haven't developed phonemic awareness. But we know that phonemic awareness comes in conjunction with letter knowledge. And can I just read? So he recommends the methods that's in this book called Let's Read. And I just want to read to you the method and get your reactions as teachers and coaches who teach children how to read. It says, when we present a pair of words like can and fan, a child may have no notion that these words are similar in sound, or that the similar spelling indicates a similar sound. It would be a waste of time to try, as the advocates of phonic methods, to explain this to him. All we do is to present such words together. The resemblance of sound and spelling will do its work without any explanation from us. Only we must remember that this takes a great deal of time and repetition. The method that's advocated is you show the child the word can, you say C-A-N, can, you have them repeat it, and then you go through the rest of the rhyme.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know anybody, regardless of which activities Judy chooses for decoding, which ones I choose, which ones you choose. This is not close to what any of us do for beginning reading instruction.
Well, I can tell you that basically when I was a kid, that was kind of what they did. They did word families, and they would put a little family like the Ann family in the roof, And then in the house would go all the words that had and, can, fan, man. And basically, it was that analytic way of, looking at a part and then assuming that if you got this, you could get the rest. But again, Harriet, you pointed out something that there could be experts with very strong, research behind certain practices, but then sometimes you got to look at things a little more carefully. So, Judy, any thoughts about what Harriet just said? Giving that example or the phonemic awareness proficiency debacle?
Well, you know what's interesting? So I think that our first episode on the literacy view, the one where I was actually totally not a professional podcaster at all, which I'm not even now. I was in bed. It was nighttime. And the number one episode that we did, it was in the dark, was about phonemic awareness. And I think we were following as teachers, because that's what I'm still a teacher. I coach, I teach. Tomorrow I'm going into a classroom and I'm modeling how to decode CVC words and close syllables again to some first graders that unfortunately are still struggling with that, but it's okay. But, even back then, before we spoke to a lot of these people, Faith and I, we were following the research and we were curious about the research. And as soon as we heard that something was shifting, I think that we were so open to what's better for kids. And I think that's the most important thing to keep in mind. I mean, I would never be where I am today if I just stayed in my reading recovery bubble and said, you know what? No, I'm in a different camp. I'm going to do everything exactly the way I did it. I don't believe what any of you are saying. And it is what it is. No, it doesn't matter which camp you're in. When research and evidence comes out, you need to make shifts. It is not it's a non-negotiable. When things are coming out, and I think the really important thing is that, when somebody like Tiffany was speaking, she makes it so practical in its explanation that it makes sense. It's not that I'm just doing something because somebody told me to do it. It makes sense why we're prioritizing blending. That's an integral piece of learning how to read. It makes sense that we're thinking of words and segmenting them and hearing each phoneme. That makes sense. Now, why were we doing so much rhyme? Was that the most important skill to teach kids how to read? The research said no. It had some value maybe, but we don't have a lot of time to waste in those classrooms. We are fighting for every single minute as coaches, as teachers. We know that cracking the code for 60% of our kids is not as easy as we assumed that it was. Some kids in the early days of my career, I always thought there was like 4 kids that struggled when I was a classroom teacher. But knowing what I know now, there were probably a lot more struggling kids than I actually realized. So I think that wherever you are on your journey, don't just be so black and white. Just open up your mind and be a little bit more reflective. It doesn't matter if it's Tim Shanahan that says it or Anita Archer that says it. Follow the research and think for yourself critically. How is this helping kids?
Skeptical. I think skepticism is healthy too. Be a little skeptical. So I want to bring some attention to Steve Dykstra. We had him on. He's a no BS bestie. He's been on our show a couple of times. And you brought up a few Steve Dykstra quotes. And I think what's important with Steve is that he's always very measured in what he says. He's not really, black or white. There are shades of gray. Could you talk a little bit about, Harriet, why you chose Steve when you were writing this blog and some of the quotes that you chose? Because I would agree with you that when he explained something, he talked about hitting the target, the bullseye. Could you talk a little bit about getting near the bullseye or being so far away from the bullseye in terms of research?
Right. I'm glad you're asking. Steve Dykstra's contributions in the blog are a late addition because I only watched his webinar a few weeks ago, and it's about uncertainty. And he takes a long time to contextualize the whole phonemic awareness conundrum. Before then, he talks about bullseye research, what we know that we have to do that really is settled. We know there aren't multiple cues that proficient readers use. They use cues for word identification, which are the letters and the sounds, and then they use other cues for word confirmation. And they're two different things, and it keeps being conflated to this day. Okay, so he talks about when it comes to phonemic awareness, we know the importance of segmenting and blending. That is bullseye research that Linnea Airy and others have done. What about advanced PA? And he takes what he says is, and I use this line, we don't have to be right. We have to have right reasons that we can explain to professionals. So he gave it, for instance, you've got children who aren't responding. They're not responding to segmenting and blending and phonemic awareness with letters. Maybe this is an instance where teaching advanced phonemic awareness skills, substitution and deletion, might help. That's your reason for doing it. So he goes out of his way to contextualize the choices we make rather than saying, this is what you do, buy this program, do this with everybody, do it every day. And as Judy said, we don't have enough time. We don't have enough time. And experts need to stop confusing us because and they need to stop and think about what they're recommending, because it makes its way into books, it makes its way into articles.
It also makes its way on Twitter. Like Faith, I'm not going to say any names, but Faith will say, Judy, did you see those tweets between the experts? And I'm like, whoa. Now there's some really bright people that are going back and forth. I don't know. It's like airing your dirty laundry online. You're seeing like a lot of stuff going on. And then you're like, wait a minute. How do I, as the teacher in the field, now make sense? This person that I respect is saying this person that I respect is saying that. So Harriet, what are some additional words of wisdom how to navigate? Because, social media, that's another force that we have to navigate through.
And I just have to interrupt. I don't think what you're thinking about was Twitter. I think it was Facebook. When I pointed out to you.
You are correct. Don't spill all the beans, Faith.
The back and forth between, an expert and somebody who also we respect greatly. So I think it's a good point. So
what do we do tomorrow? We might see things on Facebook again, and it's really these discussions, and it's like, how do we navigate through it?
Can I give you an example? I just heard a podcast 2 days ago, two highly respected educators, and this podcast was on responsive teaching, and they completely disagreed about the value of think, pair, share. One thought it was a valuable addition to the classroom. One thought it was a waste of time. and they had a really intelligent discussion. So I think rather than experts, we need informed practitioners, literacy coaches, and personnel who can show us, who can do it, who can demonstrate and model and guide us through it, and are not just saying, oh, read this article or do this. I think we need, because you're right. How do we gain knowledge? How do we change?
I am going to give you big cheers for that.
Faith, was that a new dance you invented? Faith was like dancing. Harriet, I think you're the first guest that she had.
I am dancing.
You might have danced on one episode. There was one
yes.
episode.
Well, yes, I'm doing the happy dance because I think, Harriet, you hit on something. Feasibility. Molly Ness mentioned this on one of our episodes. We had her on as a guest, and we were talking about fidelity. And she said, you know what? Sometimes fidelity to a bloated program is impossible. So
a lot of F-bombs flying out of your mouth, Faith. Fidelity, feasibility. Wow, the F-bombs are flying.
Feasibility is where it's at. What Harriet's saying is we need people in the field who can demonstrate that this is a realistic expectation, not just in a lab or on a piece of paper. I believe that's what Harriet is saying here, correct?
Yes, and let me give you, ironically, my very first experience with this problem was in my teacher training college to become an English teacher a million years ago. I had heard, I was a substitute teacher. I was planning to get my credential the way a lot of us do. We sub first. We think we want to become teachers. And I had heard from people in this program who had now become teachers what an incredible supervisor was at the local teacher training college for students who wanted to become English teachers. I could not wait to have this supervisor. They said, he's so helpful. He knows what he's doing. We use the strategies and the materials and the lessons he gives us. The college fired him because he didn't have a PhD. He only had a master's. And they hired a very nice woman, bless her heart, who had a PhD in confluent education. None of us knew what that was. She couldn't explain it to us. She had nothing to offer in the way of teaching English to high school students. And I had not read at that time, because it hadn't been written, Lemony Snicket's wonderful series. But in the first book, he refers to Mr. Poe as being as helpful as a jar of mustard. And that was my supervisor, as helpful as a jar of mustard, right? We don't get it in our teacher training colleges. I didn't get it in my reading specialist credential program. We're thrown out there. And then the heroes come down from Mount Olympus, and they tell us we have to do it this way. We don't know enough that it doesn't make sense, except that, Faith, you have mentioned this, and I think maybe Robert Pondicio also mentioned it when he was teaching balanced literacy to his fifth graders. You have said you could see which of your kids were okay, but there was this large group of kids that weren't, and you had no idea what to do. And, you know, it perpetuated those methods that weren't reaching all of our kids, perpetuated themselves because teachers didn't know it wasn't the method. They thought, oh, it's the poverty, it's the lack of literacy in the home, it's all the other factors. So I'm telling you, what we do is hard, and sometimes experts don't make it easier for us.
And Judy, what you talked about Twitter. How many of those BL experts, balanced literacy experts, keep talking about poverty? They keep talking about every other reason except that we're not really following.
But I think that there's people on the SOR world that do the same exact thing too and talk about poverty too. And and it's all, and I think when it comes into the knowledge campaign, that also plays in. Why are we assuming that kids that live in a certain demographic, maybe some kids don't, you know what I mean? So I think those kind of biases come from all sides, to be honest, Faith. I don't know.
Well, I'm thinking that what I'm seeing mostly is that there are these people who are thought of as experts. For instance, Nancy Bailey came out
Dun
with
dun dun.
and I couldn't get an answer from her. She kept saying that, SOR people don't really believe in picture books. All right. And I kept trying to pin her down. Give me a name. Tell me one person who has ever said this, that picture books should not be used in a classroom that follows the evidence. Whoever said that? And then she comes up with a blog, and it still doesn't have one person who ever said that. It comes up with names that she threw out, but not one quote of someone who said, from an expert in, who's a proponent of SOR, not to use picture books. So there are these mixed messages. There's misinformation, distortions.
I agree with you, but I just think that it's also on all sides. And like even with the knowledge building stuff, like who knows which knowledge is important to kids, right? There's things that generally all kids should know, but some knowledge about certain neighborhoods, either where I live or where I teach, there's additional knowledge that's important to cover with kids too. So I think that in general, all sides need to like start having conversations together. I think we need to like tear down these walls of being on sides, because what these sides are basically doing is dividing kids. And it's the same thing. It's like the political landscape in our country as well. It's so divisive. When are people just going to realize that we're all in this together to help kids? And we're never going to have all the same beliefs. Even you and I, Faith, right? We're going to do some more episodes where we probably won't agree on everything 1,001%. But how did we all become so divisive that we just feel that it's more important to prove a point than to do what's best for kids? And I think Harriet made another really good point. Harriet's point about valuing practitioners in the field that are doing the work is so important, because where we get a lot of our feedback as practitioners? When we see those faces of kids, and if they're getting what the research is saying is best to do, or if they're not, and seeing those kids and what they're producing in the field is the direct feedback that we as instructors and teachers get. Oh, I might need to do something a little differently tomorrow. And I can give a practical example, right? So blending is really hard for a lot of students where I work at one of my sites. And I know that I've been following the research on how important blending is, but I saw that there was some new evidence that continuous blending was very helpful for some kids. So yes, it didn't come naturally the first day. And I was like, okay, let me see if this is going to help kids. And you know what? For some kids, it's really helpful. And I think that the most important thing that, the message that I'm getting from Harriet is just be flexible, be open to learning. And Harriet, I was thinking about you. I was like, oh my God, Harriet wrote a book. Faith wrote a book. Harriet wrote a book. I did not. I don't have any plans. I make too many typos. But Harriet wrote a book. And Harriet, that's very brave of you to write a book, because like you put some things in writing and those things might change, right? Research or evidence might change and something might now be different. Harriet, so what do you do? Like, what if now you put something in concrete writing? It's here in my hand. What if something changes? What are you going to do about it?
Okay, first of all, that's a great point. Secondly, because that book is self-published, all you have to do is click unpublish, change what's wrong, and republish. So it's very easy for the self-publisher, not so. Yeah, but also too, if the back of the book, I wrote a piece called "The Practitioner's Predicament." What do I teach, and why do I teach it? And it's, again, so I love that Steve Dykstra said it's okay to be wrong. Give your reasons why you're making the choices you make. When I taught kindergarten, and I've only taught it once, it's a long story, but it was a complex maternity leave. So I took over rather than have there be a series of 30-day subs. And I thought this is a wonderful opportunity. I was working as a reading specialist, but I had not taught kindergarten. I had not taught beginning reading. I had two experts. I had Diane McGinnis emphasize sounds rather than names. And I had Stanislaus Dehaene in his book, Reading in the Brain, say, the hookup is just with phonemes. Just focus on the phonemes. Those were my reasons for doing that. This is a controversial topic. It's not settled, but it worked. I cut out the middleman. It focused my lessons. It was best for my struggling readers. I had reasons for doing what I did. So I think it's okay to be wrong. It's okay to be wrong.
And I
change it.
And I think that's where we're going to leave off, because it's okay to be wrong, but own it. Own it and let people know that your thinking has evolved, and show it, support it with the research maybe that you are in the process of doing. But, we've had Nate Joseph on, and he always owns it. He always owns it. That's why I think he's so loved out there, that he is somebody who will readily admit when he doesn't get something right, and he'll go back and he'll revisit, and he'll make a public announcement how his thinking has changed. We need more people like that. Excuse me. So, excuse me. Harriet, is there anything that we have not covered that you would like to add?
If you've got a minute, I just want to say, in some respects, it feels like Groundhog Day, because just 2 days ago, there was a piece published by a education professor who's just written a book, who is recommending balanced literacy, a balanced approach. And what he says is, we don't want to teach decoding separately. We want to teach it in the context of meaningful, authentic literature. Have either one of you heard that before? Teach phonics in the context of authentic literature? And I just want to say, I love the way, and I use this in my book, Claude Goldenberg says, we need to help our students separate the signal from the noise. If they're reading a meaningful text, if it's got rich vocabulary, if it's got a compelling story, and by the way, let's stop and look at the A. This word has AY, but this one has AI. Hey, gang, you can spell it 2 different ways. Now let's get on with the story. He says, separate the signal from the noise. And it is a straw man, as you pointed out, Faith, with Nancy Bailey. Nobody is saying don't read to kids, don't teach kids, don't authentic literature. We know it's the cornerstone of what we do. That's what I wanted to say.
That was awesome, Harriet.
Really, I just love this conversation. And I think Judy and I could probably spend another hour
I
talking
think we
to
found a new no BS bestie. What a fun
Oh,
episode
she's
to be.
been my no BS bestie.
I mean,
But
3 teachers on a podcast together, 3 teachers with a lot of experience and a lot of passion. This was dynamic. I just want to end one thing also, Faith. You said something in your forward that in Harriet's book that really, really resonated with me. You said, like Harriet, I had to learn through trial and error, ask lots of questions, and kiss a lot of frogs until finding my prince. Keep looking for your prince, everybody, in education. Be like Faith. Faith, did you find your prince?
I live with him. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
So,
Keep
yeah.
asking those questions. That's what the Literacy View is all about.
Well, thank you for pulling out that quote. That was great. So we want to wrap up. Judy, you want to tell everyone how to get in touch with us?
All right. So follow us on Instagram, theliteracyview.com. Follow us on our website, theliteracyview.com. Follow Faith on Twitter at High Five Literacy. Follow me at Boxner Judy. And you know where to find us. Also, please, please, please join our Facebook group. It's growing. We almost hit 4,000. And the goal is to hit 10,000 by the end of the school year. So share with your friends, tell your colleagues. And Harriet, it's been an absolute privilege to get to know you. And definitely everybody check out Harriet's book, From Sound to Summary. I can't wait to dig deeper into it. And thank you. Bye, everyone.
It's a great book.
Thank you. This was such fun. Thank you.
Wonderful. All right.